Nobody expected this. The courtiers were blindsided. Constitutional experts scrambled for precedent. Senior palace officials who have spent decades believing they understood how power moved inside the British monarchy suddenly found themselves staring at a decision that rewrote every assumption they held. One signature changed everything. King Charles signed an emergency order, quiet, deliberate, devastatingly precise. And with that single act, Catherine, Princess of Wales, became the sole guardian of the crown jewels, a role that has never, in modern royal history, belonged to anyone outside the sovereign's direct line. Until now. Inside the palace, absolutely nobody is calm about it. It started with a phone call, not a press release, or an official announcement delivered through the usual channels of royal communication. A phone call, made quietly to a small number of people whose positions inside the palace meant they needed to know before anyone else did. And what those people were told in that phone call stopped every single one of them cold.
Tiaras worn by beautiful princesses provides a glimpse into the fascinating world of the Queen's personal jewelry collection.
King Charles had signed an emergency order. The crown jewels, the most symbolically loaded collection of objects in the entire British royal tradition, now had a new guardian, and the name attached to that guardianship was one that nobody in that small circle of senior officials had anticipated hearing. Catherine, Princess of Wales, future Queen of England. The silence that followed that phone call said everything that words could not. But before we get to the full weight of what Charles has done, and why the decision has sent shockwaves through every corridor of royal power, we need to talk about what the crown jewels actually are. Because the public understanding of these objects is almost always incomplete. Tourists visit the Tower of London, they file past the glass cases. They photograph the imperial state crown and the sovereign's orb, and then walk away believing they have seen the whole picture. They have not seen even half of it. The crown jewels are not simply a collection of beautiful and expensive objects. Understanding them purely in terms of their material value is like understanding a cathedral purely in terms of its bricks. The number most commonly cited for the collection's worth sits at somewhere in the region of £4 billion. But that figure, staggering as it is, misses the point entirely. These objects are the physical embodiment of sovereign authority. Every piece in the collection carries within it a specific weight of historical meaning, one that connects the living monarchy to a line of power stretching back through centuries of British history. The sovereign's scepter contains the largest colorless cut diamond in the world. It's the 430-carat first star of Africa, cut from the Cullinan diamond discovered in South Africa in 1905. The imperial state crown contains the famous Black Prince's ruby, a stone with a history of violence and conquest that predates the Tudor dynasty. The coronation spoon, the oldest piece in the collection, dates back to the 12th century. These are not decorations. They are the material record of a sovereign institution that has survived civil war, revolution, the dissolution of empire, and the collapse of virtually every comparable monarchy in the modern world. To hold guardianship over these objects is to hold something that goes far beyond property management or ceremonial responsibility. It is to hold the symbolic continuity of the crown itself, and that is precisely why the role of guardian has always remained within the sovereign's direct line of authority. The objects in that collection are too historically significant, constitutionally loaded and deeply embedded in the identity of the institution. They are to be entrusted to anyone whose claim to the throne is indirect or contingent. Until Charles signed his emergency order, the idea of a non-sovereign guardian was not simply unusual, it was unthinkable, which is exactly why the specific clause buried inside that order has sent constitutional lawyers reaching for their reference books with an urgency that tells its own story. The clause in question goes beyond the language of guardianship. Sources familiar with the document's contents have described the specific wording. They saw it as conferring on Catherine a category of authority over the collection that sits uncomfortably close to sovereign-adjacent power, the ability to make decisions about the collection's movement, display, and ceremonial use without requiring sign-off from any other member of the royal household, including the king himself. Let that settle for a moment. Charles has signed a document that places Catherine above his own authority, especially when it comes to the most symbolically significant objects the British monarchy possesses. The question that follows is an obvious one. Why? The official answer centers on practical necessity. Charles's health challenges have been well documented. The king has been managing a cancer diagnosis that has required treatment. The sickness has reduced his public schedule and forced the palace to think carefully about continuity of institutional function during periods when the sovereign is not at full operational capacity. From that practical standpoint, the decision has a certain logic. Someone needs to hold authority over the collection. Someone with the standing, the judgment, and the institutional credibility to make decisions about objects that are called upon for every significant ceremonial moment the monarchy produces. Catherine has all three of those things, but here is what the practical explanation does not account for. Emergency royal orders are not casual administrative instruments. The legal threshold for triggering one is significant. The constitutional implications of the powers such an order can confer are taken extremely seriously by the advisors who draft them and the lawyers who review them. You do not sign an emergency order simply to manage a scheduling inconvenience. You sign one when something more fundamental is at stake. The specific powers Charles has granted Catherine through this order suggest that something is at stake, and what is at stake here goes considerably beyond the question of who authorizes the imperial state crown's transport to the House of Lords for the state opening of Parliament. Something larger is happening, something that the emergency order is both a response to and a signal of. And to understand what that something is, you need to understand the woman Charles has chosen to trust with it. Because Catherine did not arrive at this moment by accident. The road that led to that emergency order began a long time ago, and almost nobody outside a very small circle saw where it was heading. There is a version of Catherine that the public has been sold for years. The dutiful wife and devoted mother. The elegant, carefully composed woman who shows up to engagements in perfectly chosen outfits and says precisely the right thing at precisely the right moment. The woman who transformed from a middle-class girl from Berkshire into a future queen without ever appearing to break a sweat or miss a step. That version is not false, but it is incomplete because behind the composure, the careful public management of image and message, something else has been building. Something that the people closest to the institution have been watching with a mixture of admiration and, in some quarters, considerable unease. Catherine has been quietly, systematically, and with extraordinary patience. She has been building a position of institutional power inside the British monarchy that goes far beyond what her title alone would suggest. And the emergency order did not create that position. It simply made it visible. To understand how Catherine arrived at this moment, you have to go back to the period immediately following the death of Queen Elizabeth. Because that moment, the transition from one reign to the next, was the pivot point, the moment when the architecture of the royal family shifted, and the people inside it either adapted to the new landscape or found themselves stranded by it. Catherine adapted, faster and more completely than almost anyone outside her immediate circle anticipated. Within weeks of Charles's accession, sources close to the palace describe a noticeable shift in the way Catherine operated inside the institution, the deference that had characterized her public positioning during the Queen's reign. The careful step back and the deliberate subordination of her own profile to the senior figures above her began to give way to something more direct. It was more assured and clearly intentional. Meetings that Catherine had previously attended in a supporting capacity became meetings where her voice carried decisive weight. Conversations about the direction of royal charitable initiatives, about the public positioning of the Wales household, and the long-term strategic priorities of the institution began to reflect her perspective in ways that were unmistakable to those present. This was not a woman finding her feet. This was a woman who had been waiting with extraordinary discipline for the moment when the ground beneath those feet finally belonged to her. The relationship between Catherine and Charles is central to this story, and it is a relationship that the public has consistently underestimated. The narrative most people carry is one of a cordial but essentially formal connection between a father-in-law and his son's wife, respectful, warm on ceremonial occasions, but not particularly deep. That narrative is wrong. Sources familiar with the dynamics inside the royal household describe a relationship between Charles and Catherine that has developed into something considerably more substantive, a genuine alignment of institutional values, a shared understanding of what the monarchy needs to be in order to survive the pressures of the 21st century, a mutual respect that goes beyond family obligation into something closer to genuine strategic partnership. Charles sees in Catherine qualities that he has spent his entire reign searching for in the people around him: the ability to hold a long view, the discipline to subordinate personal feelings to institutional necessity, the kind of steady, unshowy competence that does not seek credit but consistently delivers results. These are qualities Charles values above almost everything else, and Catherine has demonstrated them over the course of a relationship that has deepened considerably since Charles became king. The period of Charles's health challenges was a defining chapter in that relationship. When the king's cancer diagnosis became public in February of 2024, the palace faced a challenge that went beyond medical management. The institution needed to demonstrate continuity. It needed to signal to the public and to the world that the machinery of the monarchy was not compromised by the sovereign's reduced capacity. Catherine was already surviving her own health crisis at that point. The abdominal surgery in January of 2024, the subsequent recovery period, the cancer diagnosis that followed, and the months of preventative chemotherapy. All of it was unfolding in the full and merciless glare of public scrutiny. What happened during that period revealed something about Catherine's character that the institution will not forget. Sources close to the palace describe a woman who remained engaged with the institutional questions that the king's reduced capacity had placed on the agenda, not in a way that overstepped, or in a way that drew attention and generated any suggestion of opportunism, but in a quiet, consistent, entirely characteristic way that demonstrated the kind of reliability that institutions depend on in moments of genuine vulnerability. Charles noticed, the king had always respected Catherine. But respect and trust are different things, and it was during this shared period of health difficulty, during this parallel experience of managing serious illness while maintaining institutional responsibility, that Charles's respect for his daughter-in-law deepened into something closer to genuine trust. That trust manifested in specific ways. Conversations that had previously been conducted between Charles and William alone began, gradually, to include Catherine. Briefings that had been reserved for the most senior figures in the household started to reflect her involvement. Decisions about the long-term direction of the institution began to carry the imprint of her perspective in ways that represented a significant expansion of her role. And then there was the exchange that, sources say, changed everything. The specific details of the conversation remain private. Royal households guard their most significant internal communications with a thoroughness that makes confirmation difficult. But multiple sources familiar with the situation have described a private meeting between Charles and Catherine. They held it in the period following the king's return to public duties, in which the future of the crown jewels and their guardianship was discussed directly. What Charles said in that meeting, and what Catherine's response revealed about her understanding of the role and its implications, is described by those familiar with the exchange as the moment the king made his decision, not the emergency order. The decision behind the emergency order, because Charles is a man who thinks in long arcs, a man who makes his most significant choices not in response to immediate circumstances, but in response to a vision of the institution's future that extends far beyond the current moment. The emergency order that placed the crown jewels in Catherine's guardianship was the formal expression of a conclusion Charles had already reached privately. The conclusion that Catherine was not simply a future queen. She was the person the institution needed most in this specific and fragile moment of transition. And the crown jewels, with everything they represent about the continuity and authority of the crown, were the most powerful signal Charles could send about where his trust resided. But a decision of this magnitude does not land quietly. An order of this kind, conferring authority this unprecedented on a figure this significant, sends a message to every person inside the institution, everyone whose position is touched by the new power structure it creates. And some of those people are very unhappy indeed. The document existed before most people inside the palace knew it was being drafted. That detail alone tells you something important. Emergency royal orders of this magnitude are not produced overnight. The legal architecture required to construct one, the constitutional review, the advisory sign-off, the careful calibration of language that will withstand scrutiny from lawyers, historians, and constitutional experts for decades to come, takes time. It takes planning. and it takes a level of deliberate, sustained intention that cannot be mistaken for impulse or reaction. Charles had been thinking about this for a long time, and the fact that the drafting process was conducted with such extraordinary discretion, and with so few people inside the institution aware that it was happening until the moment it was complete, tells you something else equally important. The king did not want interference. He did not want the conversations or the objections, nor does he want the careful diplomatic pushback from senior courtiers and household officials, one that would inevitably have followed had the order's contents become known during its preparation. He wanted the decision made cleanly, completely, and without the kind of institutional friction that has derailed more than one significant royal initiative before it could reach the point of formal execution. So, the drafting happened quietly, and when the document was finally placed before Charles for his signature, the circle of people present was deliberately, pointedly small. Now, let us talk about what an emergency royal order actually is, because the term sounds dramatic in a way that can obscure its precise constitutional meaning. And the precise constitutional meaning matters enormously here. An emergency royal order is a formal instrument of sovereign authority. It sits within a long-established legal tradition that allows the monarch to make binding decisions about matters of institutional significance, without requiring the full apparatus of parliamentary process or formal cabinet consultation. The threshold for invoking this instrument is not simply inconvenience or preference. The circumstances must meet a defined standard of institutional necessity, a standard that is reviewed and confirmed by the legal advisors who sign off on the order before it reaches the sovereign's desk. The fact that Charles's legal team confirmed that threshold had been met is itself a significant piece of information. It means that the lawyers who reviewed the circumstances surrounding this decision concluded that the situation facing the institution was serious enough, and the need for decisive action clear enough to justify the use of a mechanism that bypasses the usual channels of royal decision-making. What those circumstances specifically were has not been made fully public. The palace has offered only the broadest official framing. It is centering on the practical necessities created by the king's ongoing health management and the need to ensure uninterrupted institutional function during periods of reduced sovereign capacity. That framing is accurate as far as it goes, but it does not go far enough to explain the specific powers the order actually confers. Because a simple delegation of administrative authority over the crown jewels collection would not have required an emergency order, that kind of practical arrangement could have been achieved through far less constitutionally significant instruments. A royal warrant, a formal delegation of specific duties to a named individual. Any number of established mechanisms exist for exactly that kind of administrative transfer. Charles did not use any of them. The king reached for the most powerful formal instrument available to a sovereign outside of an act of parliament. And the reason lies in the specific nature of the authority the order was designed to confer. The order grants Catherine 3 distinct categories of power over the crown jewels collection. The first is custodial authority. This is the most straightforward element. Catherine now holds formal legal responsibility for the physical security, preservation, and maintenance of the collection. Decisions about storage, conservation, insurance, and the management of the Tower of London's relationship with the collection in terms of public display now require her direct sign-off. This element alone would have been significant, but it is the least significant of the three. The second category is ceremonial authority. This is considerably more loaded. Under the terms of the order, Catherine now holds the power to authorize the use of specific pieces from the collection for state and ceremonial occasions, the deployment of the imperial state crown for the state opening of Parliament, the selection of pieces for coronation ceremonies, the authorization of specific jewels for official state visits and diplomatic occasions. These decisions, previously the exclusive domain of the Lord Chamberlain's office acting under direct sovereign instruction, now flow through Catherine. The constitutional implications of that transfer are significant enough on their own, but it is the third category that has lawyers and historians paying the closest attention. The third category is what sources familiar with the document's contents have described, carefully and with evident awareness of the weight of the language, as protective sovereign authority. Under specific defined circumstances, Catherine holds the power to make decisions about the collection that supersede the authority of any other member of the royal household. Any other member. The order does not use the word supersede. The language is more carefully constructed than that, but the functional meaning is unmistakable to anyone with a working knowledge of constitutional law. In the circumstances defined by the order, Catherine's authority over the crown jewels answers only to the sovereign, and under the specific conditions outlined in those same clauses, even that qualification carries a caveat. The precise nature of those conditions has not been confirmed publicly. But constitutional lawyers who have reviewed the broad outlines of what the order is reported to contain have pointed to one interpretation that they describe as the only reading that fully accounts for the instrument's legal architecture. The order was constructed to remain operative in the event of sovereign incapacity, not the temporary managed incapacity of a king managing a cancer diagnosis, while remaining functionally engaged with his duties, a more fundamental incapacity, the kind that would ordinarily trigger a regency. If that interpretation is correct, and the sources familiar with the document suggest it is, then what Charles has signed is not simply an administrative arrangement or a practical delegation of ceremonial responsibility. It is a contingency plan, a formal, legally binding, constitutionally structured contingency plan, one that places Catherine at the center of the institution's continuity framework in a way that has no modern precedent. William was briefed before the order was signed. That much has been confirmed by sources close to the Wales household. The future king was not simply informed as a courtesy. The briefing was substantive. The conversation between father and son about the order's contents and implications was, by multiple accounts, lengthy and serious. And William's response to everything he was told in that briefing revealed something that the people present in that conversation have not forgotten. He was not surprised, not by the order itself, not by the powers it conferred, nor was he surprised by the role it placed Catherine in. Right at the center of the institution's most sensitive contingency framework, William already knew. The question of how long the future king had known, and what that foreknowledge reveals about the conversations happening at the very top of the royal family, is one that the video will soon answer. But it will also raise a question considerably more unsettling. If William already knew, who else did? And who, in finding out, has decided that what Charles has done cannot go unanswered? Power never shifts quietly. It does not matter how carefully the paperwork is drafted. It does not matter how discreet the process. Nor does it matter how small the circle of people present when the signature is applied to the page. The moment power moves from one set of hands to another inside an institution as ancient and as politically layered as the British monarchy, the reverberations travel. It goes through corridors, through households, through the carefully maintained networks of loyalty and obligation that hold the whole structure together. And when those reverberations reach the people whose own positions have been diminished by the movement, the response is rarely measured. The fallout from Charles's emergency order began within hours of the document's existence becoming known beyond the initial circle, and the people most affected by it wasted very little time making their feelings understood, especially through the channels that senior royal figures have always used when they want to communicate displeasure without leaving fingerprints. The quiet word to a trusted journalist, the carefully placed source close to a specific household, the background briefing that shapes a narrative without ever requiring anyone to speak on the record. These are the weapons of palace politics, and in the days following the order's signing, they were deployed with considerable force. Camilla's position in the immediate aftermath of the order, becoming known inside the palace, is described by sources as one of controlled but visible tension. The Queen Consort has spent years constructing a public image built on composure and institutional reliability, the carefully managed warmth, the self-deprecating humor that disarms critics. The visible devotion to Charles that has, over time, converted a significant portion of a once hostile public into something approaching genuine affection. That composure did not entirely hold in private. Sources close to the king's household describe a woman who processed the implications of the order, with a clarity that made her reaction all the more pointed. Camilla understood immediately what the document meant, not the administrative surface of it, the deeper institutional message, the confirmation that the center of gravity inside the royal family had shifted decisively toward William and Catherine's household. and away from the king and queen consort's sphere of influence. That shift had been underway for some time. The inheritance decision regarding William's private estate had been an earlier signal. The consistent expansion of Catherine's institutional role had been another. But an emergency royal order conferring sovereign adjacent authority over the crown jewels was something of an entirely different magnitude. And Camilla, with the political instincts she has honed across decades of overcoming impossible situations, recognized it as such immediately. The specific point of tension between Camilla's household and the new arrangement centers on ceremonial authority. The queen consort has held a degree of informal influence over the ceremonial life of the monarchy. Though never formally codified, it was nonetheless real and consistently exercised. Decisions about state occasions, about the deployment of royal symbolism and the aesthetic and ceremonial identity of the crown have flowed through conversations. Conversations that included Camilla's perspective in ways that mattered. Under the terms of the emergency order, those conversations now flow through Catherine. The courtiers are another story entirely. And in some ways, the reaction from within the professional ranks of the palace household has been more structurally significant. More significant than anything coming from the family itself. Senior officials who have served the institution for decades and built their entire professional identity around their proximity to specific decision-making processes now find themselves operating inside a power structure that has been fundamentally reorganized without their input or consultation. The Lord Chamberlain's office has been particularly affected. The transfer of ceremonial authority to Catherine did not simply reassign a function. It removed a layer of professional influence that the officials in that office had considered a permanent feature of their institutional landscape. The reaction within those professional ranks has been described by sources as deeply unsettled, not openly hostile. These are people who have spent careers learning to manage their responses to decisions made above their level. But the unease is real, and it is not being entirely concealed from the people positioned to observe it. Prince Andrew's reaction to the order sits in a category of its own. The Duke of York has spent the years since his catastrophic BBC interview in a condition of enforced institutional irrelevance. He has been excluded from public duties and stripped of the military titles and royal patronages that once gave his position visible substance. The emergency order did not directly affect Andrew's already diminished standing, but the symbolic weight of watching Catherine elevated to a position of unprecedented institutional authority, while his own role remains one of invisible and involuntary absence, has not been lost on those who remain close to him. Sources familiar with Andrew's private response describe a bitterness that is by now almost structural, less a reaction to any specific decision, and more a permanent condition generated by the accumulating weight of everything the institution has taken from him. But the most significant private conversation in the immediate aftermath of the order becoming known did not involve Camilla, Andrew, or any senior courtier. It took place between two figures whose names have not been attached to any public statement about the order. Two senior palace officials whose combined institutional knowledge and proximity to the decision-making processes of multiple royal households makes their assessment of any significant development as close to a ground truth reading as the palace produces. One of them said something that has stayed with everyone who was told about it afterward. This is not a response to a crisis. It is the preparation for one. Nobody in that conversation disagreed. And the nature of that crisis, what Charles knows, and what it means for the future of everything the British monarchy has spent 1,000 years building, is exactly where this story has been heading all along. Every institution has a moment, a single, defining decision that separates what the institution was from what it is becoming. A moment that historians will eventually identify as the pivot point. The place where the old architecture gave way and the new one began, quietly and irrevocably, to take its shape. Charles's emergency order is that moment for the British monarchy. Not because of the crown jewels themselves, or because of the administrative and ceremonial powers the order redistributes, but because of what the decision reveals about the king's understanding of where the institution stands right now and what it needs to survive the years ahead. Charles has always been a man who thinks for centuries. The environmental commitments that defined his public identity long before they became mainstream political currency. The architectural philosophy that positioned him as a defender of historical continuity against the pressures of modernization. The deep, almost spiritual connection to the land and the traditions of the British countryside that has shaped his private life as completely as it has his public one. These are not the instincts of a man thinking about the next news cycle. They are the instincts of a man thinking about the next generation. And the emergency order is, at its deepest level, a generational act. By placing Catherine at the center of the institution's most sensitive continuity framework, Charles has done something that goes beyond practical delegation or ceremonial reorganization. The king has formally embedded the next chapter of the monarchy's identity into the present moment. He has made Catherine not simply the future of the institution, but an active, legally empowered participant in its present. A bridge, built in constitutional language and sovereign authority, between the reign that exists now and the reign that is coming. That bridge matters more than most people outside the palace fully understand. Monarchies do not simply transfer from one sovereign to the next, like a baton passed in a relay race. The transition between reigns is a period of profound institutional vulnerability. The relationships, the informal power structures, the accumulated trust between the crown and the people and institutions that surround it, all of it must be carefully managed across the fault line of succession. Get that management wrong, and the consequences can take generations to repair. Charles knows this. The king has watched enough of royal history, lived enough of it personally, to understand exactly how much can be lost in a badly managed transition. And the emergency order is his most explicit act yet of ensuring that the transition to William's reign does not carry that risk. Catherine is the guarantee. Her guardianship of the crown jewels is not simply a practical arrangement. It is a constitutional signal to every person and institution connected to the monarchy that the continuity of sovereign authority has been secured, that the objects which embody that authority are held by someone whose commitment to the institution is beyond question, whose judgment has been tested under the most difficult personal and public circumstances imaginable, whose vision of what the monarchy should be aligns with remarkable precision, with the vision that Charles himself has spent his entire reign trying to realize. And then there is the detail that nobody in the official framing of this story has addressed directly: the specific conditions under which Catherine's authority supersedes that of any other member of the royal household, including the caveated qualification regarding the sovereign's own authority. It all points toward a scenario that the palace has not publicly acknowledged, but that the emergency order was clearly designed to address. Charles knows something about the trajectory of his own health that has not been fully shared with the public. The official statements have been carefully optimistic: the managed return to public duties, the visible engagement with the ceremonial life of the institution, the deliberate projection of a king who is present and functional. All of it has served its purpose in maintaining public confidence. But emergency orders do not lie. Legal instruments drafted at the highest level of constitutional seriousness do not include contingency clauses for scenarios that nobody genuinely anticipates. The architecture of this order tells a story that the public statements do not. Charles is preparing for something, and Catherine, with the crown jewels in her guardianship and sovereign adjacent authority in her hands, is the preparation. The girl who once waited is now the woman who holds the most powerful symbolic objects the British monarchy possesses. The woman who endured years of public scrutiny, personal crisis, and institutional patience now stands at the center of the crown's continuity framework with the full legal authority of an emergency royal order behind her. The crown jewels have survived wars, revolutions, and the collapse of empires. Now they rest with her, and everything about the way Charles made that decision suggests he believes, with the settled conviction of a man who has thought about it for a very long time, that with her is exactly where they belong. They dismissed her once, the girl from Berkshire. She was the commoner who waited, the woman they said had no real power of her own. Charles just answered that dismissal with the most binding legal instrument a sovereign can sign. The crown jewels, the physical soul of a 1,000-year monarchy, now rest in Catherine's hands, not by accident or by proximity, by deliberate, constitutional, irrevocable design. The wait was never a weakness. It was the strategy,